I specialize in rural communities, and specifically I work at the, essentially, I study when Indigenous communities and rural communities work together. So what I am going to be talking about today, though, is what do we do about AI, right? Because I'm an energy geographer. I'm also a young person, and I'm perplexed. And I know that some of you might also be. And essentially, the goal of this presentation is to explore what should we do, right? Because this is the future. This is the next technological revolution. So how are we going to engage with it, right? And I'd like to start off by saying that I'm not anti-AI. As you can see, there's an AI note taker that actually I didn't choose to have it in here, but it's required. And I'll go into that as well in terms of the fact that I will be critical in this presentation, and specifically what I will be critical of is not around it. So this is a good example. All right, but anyway, I'm not going to speak on my case before I make it. So let's get started. So yeah, so a little bit about me. I worked for a Department of Energy lab for a few years, and essentially what I did when I worked there is I worked in energy planning, and I specifically was kind of a socio-technical liaison. So I worked with engineers and social scientists to essentially understand the full scope of energy planning in terms of how does energy infrastructure impact communities, right? And we worked with coastal communities, we worked with tribal communities, we worked with a lot of quote unquote like isolated communities, right? Because a lot of energy infrastructure is in rural areas due to the amount of land that is available there, right? For mega infrastructure, essentially. I'm from a rural, and essentially what I found when we were doing this research and we did a lot of interviews was that this concept of NIMBYism, right, not in my backyardism, which is a reasonable and real critique, right, of a lot of resistance to decarbonized infrastructure in general, right, that you just don't want it in your backyard because it's ugly, right? It ruins the view. And there's a lot of discourse and over the last decade, this isn't a new idea, but essentially around that these communities are ruining it for everyone else because they just don't want a wind turbine to be seen from their house, right? So what I found was that terminology, NIMBYism, and the understanding of community resistance to infrastructure being understood as NIMBYism was kind of a catch-all, like left out part of the story, and also was an excuse to not take critique of this infrastructure seriously, right? There was an assumption that decarbonized energy, in many ways it is, but was good and shouldn't be questioned and should be accepted with open arms without any real room for criticism. Actually, what I did was after I left the lab is I studied this. I went to Goldendale, Washington, which is it's literally on the border of Washington and Oregon, right? It's a very rural community. It's actually where my grandfather grew up. So it's funny because I was doing these interviews and someone was like, "Oh, Drew, I know your last name. That's also the name of your professor." And I was like, "Yeah, that's my grandfather," Anyway, So, yeah, basically that this organization called CEASE, so Citizens Educated About Solar Energy, it's a little on the nose, right? Was collaborating with members of the neighboring Yakima Nation to oppose decarbonized infrastructure, mostly solar, right, in Klickitat County, Washington. So this is interesting for two reasons. One being that a lot of people, when I first started studying this, were like, well, that's a very unlikely coalition, right? Like they were like, what do you mean these local, largely like apolitical or libertarian, like ranchers and farm owners um, are collaborating with indigenous communities? What is happening, right? And I would push back on the fact that I don't think that's an unlikely coalition at all. And the reason I don't think that is because the and not to go too far into it because this isn't the point of the presentation, but um, essentially the way that treaties are formed in Washington is the Bolt Law treaty, or sorry, excuse me, allows Native communities to practice usual and custom practices on usual and custom places. So fishing, regardless of reservation boundaries, they are allowed to fish on the Columbia River, right? Or gather roots and berries on, for instance, bush bum, which was the subject of this article over here in Country News, High County News, excuse me, where essentially this hydro pump storage facility is being placed on bush bum, which is in violation of treaty rights, right? Because even though that is private or public property, and companies can lease that land, can get it permitted from the government, legally under the treaty, they're not allowed to touch the roots of berries on it, right? So what do you do? And so essentially, the members of CEASE, the ranchers and farmers, they have pre-existing relationships with members of the Yakima Nation in terms of the fact that, while these roots and berries were located on their quote unquote private property, right? Annually, they would open the gates and First Nation members would like practice their culture. And this was an established relationship for hundreds of years, right? And so like they knew each other. They knew they knew why it was important for First Nations to practice gathering first foods, right? And etc. So anyway, if you put infrastructure on that piece of land, you're going to piss off everybody, and that's what happened. So that's why it's a these coalitions formed naturally, right? So anyway, moral of the story, I felt like studies of resistance to infrastructure were not capturing the whole story in terms of the fact that infrastructure was good and necessary and shouldn't be questioned. Okay. And essentially, when I did my interviews, is we found that yeah, these people were reacting for a reason, right? They weren't reacting just based off of misinformation, even though I will like put in the caveat that if that's not my job to determine, I don't have the information really, and none of us do. That's the thing, is that a lot of this energy infrastructure, right, is new. We don't know the 30, 50-year impact of a solar farm, right? So how can you call it misinformation when it's simply stating, hey, we don't know, can you regulate it further because we don't know. So anyway, so what we found, and you can see in this this quote right here, is that people felt like Klickitat County was being quote unquote sacrificed, right? And uh, we are being colonized. Like they were becoming an energy colony, in the sense that they were bearing their quote unquote land was being exploited for the benefit of outside or foreign forces, right? Or companies. So yeah, and I mean this reality and this distrust, right, of outside influence is based in real context, right? Because if we look at rural areas the across the nation, right, there are history not fulfilling their promises, right? If we think about big pharma in Kentucky, if we think about CAOC in Yakima, like that's farming, right? So it's I'm not saying that farmers can't exploit each other, they can. Um, but housing in Appalachia, right? Like exploiting rural populations is a real reality that does need to be acknowledged, right? In terms of the fact that you can't put infrastructure in an area that has a history of distrust without at least acknowledging the distrust, right? What does this have to do with AI? So it's interesting because um, this is my second time giving this presentation. And the first time I did not know that they were planning on putting a data center in on exactly the site that I researched. They're using the hydro pump storage facility, the one that's going on push bump, right? Yeah, they're going to use it for a data center. And I just found that hilarious because I was talking about this because I was saying that this was a pattern of exploitation, right? That it doesn't matter the type of energy infrastructure, that it's more based off of the place, right? And this is proof of that. So anyway, it's going in there. Specifically, this concern about the fact that it's not regulated, at least the expansion of, whoa, sorry, my stuff is moving around. The expansion of data centers is in, it's kind of the wild, wild west at this point in time, and it's not heavily or even really at all state regulated. And also, it's expected to create uh, essentially, actually, you know what? I'm going to save that. I'm going to save that. But I want you to remember that one of the reasons that the facility, Rye Development, sorry, not facility, company, Rye Development, is saying that this would be a good thing for rural communities is because it would create jobs. So I want you to remember that, and we'll come back to it. Um, so yes, there's, yes, essentially communities are concerned. They're considering a moratorium. In fact, they did put a moratorium until December 31st. So yeah, so just so you know, essentially this is not something that everyone agrees on. And specifically the communities that are hosting the data centers for these AI, that drives AI, empowers AI, say, let's stop and think about this. So anyway, let's zoom out. Let's zoom out because we can't get too granular here and just focus on Goldendale, even though I love Goldendale. And I could talk about it for 15 minutes, which is what I did. So anyway, so let's zoom out. Let's talk about why this matters on a national scale, right? So you might have already heard of this. This is kind of old news. It's from 2025, right? But this is an example of an AI supercomputer that the data center, or at least the physical footprint of the AI supercomputer, was leading to toxic emissions that were specifically being, polluting a predominantly Black community in Memphis, right? And this city is a part of the Rust Belt, right? Like has been polluted by infrastructure historically, specifically if we look at cancer rates and public health concerns, it's Black communities that bear the burden of this infrastructure, right? So what I'm trying to get at is that AI is not without material connection, right? Like it's not something that just exists in the ether without any impacts, right? And there's a physical server space that needs to be taken up, which is data centers. And data centers are the physical consequence, essentially, of AI. So the general debate is that if you want, essentially what I want to talk to you about is the material concrete impact on community futures of AI. So that is something that I have some sort of background in, right? Like I'm not an AI engineer, but what I do have a background in is concrete physical impacts of infrastructure on community futures. So let's see. Yes, essentially this is going into the fact that it's going to increase methane. It's going to expand methane-powered gas turbines, and it's actually going to expand emissions past what it was permitted. So again, Wild Wild West, right? No one's listening to anything, no one's thinking about anything, etc. So what I want to get at is that this is not an isolated incident. So essentially what this is areas with the fastest data center growth. And look in the Pacific Northwest where it is. It is down Oregon and Washington, like I said. So anyway, if we look, this is predominantly rural areas. This is not an isolated incident. It's a pattern, a geographical pattern across the entire nation, right? And specifically, boom in rural America. And the reason that companies are saying that it's necessary, it is a necessary thing for rural areas, is that it will, rural areas they have declining industries such as farming, manufacturing, etc., right? And so we need to re-energize these communities, right? And we need to save rural America because they're so backwards. Earlier, what was the logic that was conveyed as the reason that RIE development would create this data center? Jobs, right? And specifically what the moratorium was stating, there is usually a misconception about how many jobs are actually provided, right? Because many engineers are employed from the union, which is not local. It's a region. So yes, it's like, okay, you're going to get maybe, or Portland, but what about Goldendale? So this whole idea that it's like, yeah, we're going to create local jobs, and it's like, it's across state lines. So there's misrepresentation about how many jobs are going to be actually provided from this, which is quote unquote the economic value proposition for the area, right? So anyway, for going back to why rural communities distrust companies, here's more proof. So anyway, I just want to take a little detour into, because I thought this would, again, I'm not an AI data center expert. I'm a community expert. So the scale of energy use for these data centers, right? So why, here, what does it say here? It says, ChatGPT consumes an estimated 14.46 billion kilowatt hours each year. And that's more electricity than 117 countries consume in a year, right? So, or more than every house in the state of Iowa. So essentially what we're getting, is that the carbon intensity and the electricity and energy needs of AI in these data centers is unique to AI. This is unprecedented. Like, this is not an amount of energy consumption that we have seen before ever. And the footprint, right, the carbon footprint of AI is the smallest it will ever be. This is the smallest it will ever be, right? And we are already teetering slash pretty much we are in a climate crisis. So so um this is going backwards, right? Like, this is putting all of the cautionary tales that we have been telling for the last 2 decades, essentially, about how we need to slow down our carbon production, all of this, we need to decarbonize. Like, this is a state of emergency, right? And now we've found an unprecedented source of carbon that we're just going to expand without regulation. Make it make sense. I'm sorry, but like, this is going backwards. This is reversing the momentum that we're feeling towards clean energy. And again, like I said, there's a dark side to clean energy. I'm not saying that clean energy is like the Hail Mary. What I'm saying is that at least it was pretending to care. um so yeah, I mean, this is concerning. This is concerning for young people, right? Because we have to live in this world, we have to have children in this world, we have to eat and breathe and drink water in this world. So also, yeah, it's dirtier energy for AI. This is so essentially it's expanding gas and fossil fuels, and it's talk about going backwards, right? So AI is inevitable. We already had problems prior to AI, and the major issue for our generation is confronting our energy future, right? This is going to be something that we cannot escape and that we need to talk about. So, the part where my brain kind of breaks, right, is viewing AI as a need to get on board with, especially as a generation, runs contrary to a future that's livable, right? And I cannot square that away in my head. Like, I cannot. Yeah, yeah. So, oh yeah, okay, so heat. Of servers, right? So this is a compounding impact where water is used to cool these servers. And essentially, not only in rural places, but in places that have water shortages. It just doesn't make any sense. So yeah, if we look at this map again, it's a geographical pattern that cannot be denied. It's a nationwide pattern. I don't, I don't know. And essentially, it's unregulated, right? Because it's this quote unquote arms race for data center footprints, right? These companies are competing against each other to generate the most generative AI, which also has material consequences in terms of the fact that you cannot have a greater technology without a greater physical impact, right? And to completely separate the two and not consider them together is foolish, in my opinion, right? Um, and it's going to lead to water shortages. That's the yeah. And it's going to have impacts on the people who live in the communities that host this infrastructure, right? Um, and more communities are saying, hell no, like why can't we drink water because Meta needs to keep up with X? Like why? And this is what I mean by NIMBYism, right? Like the whole like why me, but also like why them? You know what I mean? Like why? Um, so yeah, this isn't an isolated incident. This isn't more and more communities are pushing back. This is Arizona, right, who really stands to lose something from losing water. Um, yeah. So anyway, that's all the nuts and bolts, right? But what I actually wanted to focus on every like 15 minutes, I'm gonna be like, actually, what I wanted to do with this time is this. What I want to ask all of us, because I again do not have the answers really. I simply am doing research on Google and reading news. So uh, in progress is my question, and what I wonder about when I'm reading these articles and going on Google. What does this mean? And what I mean by that is that there are three in pro AI spaces, right? In terms of one, that technology revolutions have happened throughout history. AI is decreasing costs and increasing production. That is why another technology revolution is necessary. It works is specifically free markets, right? It works because it's constantly decreasing costs and increasing production, which is better for the end consumer, right? You're in a business class. You know this. You know this. And the third tenet of this progressive logic, right, is there will be losers in technology transitions, but it's for the greater good in the long run. So, I thought this was interesting. I was looking at different ways that revolutions have been displayed, and essentially, that what they have in common, right, is that revolutions are displayed on a timeline, and industry shifts and revolutions change material space. So for instance, the incorporation of the farmer into the metropolitan factory. So you have the rural farmers being absorbed into the urban center to work in the factory, right? So migration of humans follows the migration of technology. Again, technology in physical space shapes physical space. The expansion of the West, right? So if we're looking at expanding industry and needing more station, right? The offshoring of mass production, right? So then we reach the point where it's like, actually, the country boundaries, country borders are not enough. We need to offshore in order to decrease production to the fullest, right? We need to offshore. So again, physical space. And now what we're confronted with is that digital space that can be theoretically disconnected from the material, but what isn't, because we prove where do we go from here? you know And there's this assumption, right? Because as we think about the movement of physical space, we think about the movement of jobs, right? So movement of jobs, the urban into towards the west, expanding, and then finally expanding off into other corners of the globe. That's where the jobs go, right? So anyway, cyclical unemployment and an industry transition. And there's assumption that the economy always returns to equilibrium or full employment. And that's, a tenet of essentially why it's okay for there to be losers, because a new trade and they will enter a new industry. So we have the farmers moving to industry, we have industry moving to mass production in terms of the scale, right? We have mass production moving to the digital age, going online. And now we have online AI, right? And what is that going to look like, right? Because there's this period of tension, right, where we replace jobs as they move from one industry to the other. So where are the jobs going in this situation? And we can only really surmise based off of what we've seen, right? So let's do some surmising. So here are some data-backed explorations into technological revolution, right? So MIT. Is the assumption that we return to equilibrium true? What scholars have noticed because of AI is that we have not quantified how many jobs have been lost to machine automation in relation to how many jobs have been generated where technology creates new taste. So tasks, excuse me. So oops. The study finds, particularly since 1980, technology has replaced more U.S. jobs than was generated, right? So this assumption that we always return to full employment is false. And like this isn't a, how can you promise that, right? How can you promise that all the losers are going to be able to find new jobs? It's actually just not, it's not realistic. It's not realistic. It's not. So anyway, further, a cost of transition is increasing inequality, right? So this is a real proven reality of this, where this is a cost in terms of the fact that not only do we not gain all the jobs back, obviously, but that the difference between people in different socioeconomic brackets as they move between them, right? Or if this theory of cyclical unemployment was true, we move between socioeconomic strata easily, right? People get stuck down here and only a few people filter up here, right? So yeah. And essentially, here's what I posit, is that instead of that cyclical loop-to-loop of a flow between industries, right? Here's what I posit, is that it's a spiral. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be so doomsday. I just, where essentially the spiral demonstrates that the amount of losers just kind of accumulate and smaller. So for instance, here the farmers lose, the industry wins, then farmers and industrial manufacturers lose, and then it goes into mass production and like machine automation, right? And then we got the farmers and the industrial and the machines losing now. Again, we don't know how this is going to work out. I'm not an expert, etc. But yeah, like the whole idea of the fact that it was like white collar workers were winning when the digital age was the new technological revolution. These blue collar workers were losing, and it was kind of like, well, you won the last time, right? You blue collar workers, because the farmers lost, and now it's your turn, right? Um, but now we're getting to the point where this is AI, and who's going to be the winner? Who's going to win out of this? Um, Essentially, I suspect that AI is a departure from past technological revolutions. And specifically, um, the reason I think this is because so far what we've seen AI being used for is to fully minimize costs, right? By replacing people, and raise production to the absolute max, right? Because they've created artificial intelligence, right, to replace people. So yeah, the idea of this one man unicorn, right? That investors are looking for a company that can be run by one man but can put out the output of a whole company, right? Like this is the future that investors are telling us that we're going toward, right? And the people with the money tend to tell us what we're doing. So if that's what investors are looking for, is the one man unicorn, I'm scared, right? I'm scared because who stands to lose? It's not farmers are still losing, and we started off talking about the farmers, but it's everybody. It's everybody. And so essentially, um, assumptions about AI are based on premises that assume the question, right? Um, it assumes the benefit is coming back to us, right? And what I would like to say is, for whom are we minimizing costs and maximizing production, right? For whom is this providing greater good? Is this a trade-off that will be balanced in the future? If not, for whom does this benefit? Because we're still talking, it's the same, losers are spatialized, right? And essentially the definition of a sacrifice zone is that affect people in the same place is kind of the vibe. Um, and what I would like to ask is, why does it remain in the same place, right? Fighting the same fight over and over and over, right? It remains in communities where people have less advocacy on their behalf. Where communities, we notice this in rural areas, predominantly Black areas, the so-called global South. And these losers are determined by political winners. So that's why when we're looking at all these maps, right, it's the same places. It's the global rural areas, it's Memphis. And it's done under this guise of that it's going to be good for them, right? I'm not sure I actually want to go into this. I think I want to spend other time on other things. But essentially, there's a long lineage of critics, even the Luddites, right? Um, the Luddites, trying to see if there's anything that I need for the next. So long lineage of critics. Da, 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 da. I think it's okay. Just know that there's been a long period of people saying exactly what I'm saying. Right? I mean, this isn't new. Um, and when we think about this spiral, right, the more and more losers that we get larger and larger coalitions, right? Going back to the fact that these aren't unlikely coalitions at all. These are the forces that be, and the forces that be are the people in charge, or the people in power, right? Like essentially sacrifice zones are getting bigger, and as severely affected by these technological revolutions, the zones could get unprecedentedly large. You know what I mean? All the departure of AI from previous technologies um, is that we are starting to forget that there are material consequences, right? So anyway, back to my earlier sentiment about how I am not any technology. I'm not afraid of technology for no reason. I'm afraid of the way that we are using it. And people like me who are critical of technology, skeptical of the nature and origins of progress, are asking, are we doing this because someone is telling us that this is necessary, or is it actually necessary, right? And I'm just skeptical that it's as necessary as like I'm being forced to have an AI note taker right now, and that was not my choice, right? I want to choose when to use these tools, and why do I not have the agency to do so, right? I don't think I want to go into this either, but essentially, there's finite resources that still exist. We can't actually remove ourselves from the material, and can AI actually return on the promises that it's made, right? These promises of jobs, these promises of um, immense wealth, right? And there's a venture capital, people have been talking about that, right? That due to this plateau of information, right, that there's the vast majority of human knowledge is not coded, it's not online. And so what happens when we reach the point where everything that AI is producing is uh, falling in on, like caving in on itself essentially. And we've seen that with AI slop, right? Like the whole like AI slop thing. Um, because it's just going to generate more and more of the same misinformation. Right? So um AI is unavoidable. I will not deny this, right? Um, However, who currently is shaping that future? And do we want them shaping it? um, how do we, those who could be a part of the spiral, shape it instead? Right? So what do we do about AI? Yeah, there's currently in local politics, right? There's people thinking about the need for a pause, the need for a step back, a need to think and not blindly progress, right? For the sake of progress. But to think about what are the actual impacts and how can we do it smartly? For instance, should we be putting data centers in places that don't have any water? Um, when I worked for the Department of Energy, they were thinking about how we need to put data centers in old oil wells, right? Because those are insulated and would be able to cool these facilities with less water, right? Or even DeepSeek, right, is a Chinese AI model, and essentially they put the data center in the ocean. So the data center is literally located in the ocean, so it's called DeepSeek, and the ocean currents cool it, so it uses less fresh water, right? And there's also something about how the AI algorithm is geared toward efficiency, so that it uses less energy marginally, right? There's proposals to improve regulations in Washington. I was a part of this conversation for essentially like youth population studies, like they needed like a focus group essentially. And the resounding call for Washingtonians ages, I think it was like 18 to 26, was to regulate AI, right? Like I think a lot of us have seen, a lot of us just want some accountability, right? And I'm not saying you have to agree with that. I'm just saying there are trends. So anyway, going back to the farmers and NIMBYism, we need to take people who question new technology seriously. I think that's the main thing that you know, take it seriously, because it's not coming from nowhere. We're not just shaking our fist, right? It's people resisting and quote unquote complaining are trying to get people to listen, right? And who knows, right? There could be AI within a certain reason, right? Again, we're not saying that we're anti-AI, we're anti people telling us, right? I say we, like I'm not talking to my computer in my room by myself, but I feel that way, and maybe you do too. So yeah, so maybe the solution is not even outside of AI. Could our energy structure deal with AI in a different way that is restorative? Can we use this power in a way that can actually solve our problems with power, right? Because technology, it seems, is just exacerbating underlying power imbalances, right? Like unless we fix the fact that there are power imbalances between Black America, white America, rural America, urban America, the global South, the global North, then technology will only exacerbate it. So that's my current feeling on the subject. But I would like to ask y'all, is technology a distraction from underlying power imbalances? Yeah. So I wish that I could be in class in person, or at least synchronously, to be able to hear y'all's thoughts. But yeah, what do you think about this? And what do you think we should do about AI? I know it's a big question. What do you think? Why don't we, by next class, if you could submit to your professor or come in with talking points on one, power balances, two, what are some different ways that you could see AI improve, and three, what's something that you thought about during this presentation? And I think those would be three great talking points. So anyway, this is about me. I am going to be at the University of Victoria, pretty active on LinkedIn, I guess, kind of. And I will be posting more about my research related area, energy, planning, and politics. And I'll be based in Canada, obviously, but a lot of my research will take place throughout the river basin. So yeah, if you want to keep up to date, just follow me on LinkedIn. I'll add you back because I'm curious about y'all too. And yeah, all right. Well, thank you. And I'm going to pause there.